want to thank Mike and CTIC for inviting me. I was also invited to participate by the Soil Science Society of America primarily because I gave a couple of talks for them on this aspect of, you might say, nutrient management is related to improved water quality. So I know who some of you are by virtue of having done the registration desk. I know there's a lot of students in here, and I welcome you. But I just kind of like a rough show of hands. How many of you are consultants? Okay, a number. Anybody in here who's also a grower? Ah, thank you, sir. Anybody here representing the retail or input community? Okay, good to know. How many of you actually make fertilizer recommendations related to rate? Okay. How many of you make fertilizer recommendations related to the timing of that fertilization? Okay. How many of you make recommendations related to changing a grower's placement of nutrients? Few, not as many. And how many of you have worked on issues related to changing the source of a grower's nutrients? Okay? Now I'm going to tell each of you, except for the NRCS extension types, I'm probably going to make you uncomfortable for part of this talk. For you young folks, this is an education in try to make the audience a tad less comfortable, but try not to alienate the heck out of them, okay? No, it is part of professional life. So one of the reasons the Soil Science Society has me up here is I tend to do it better than others, at least the first part, and maybe not the part without the alienation part. So how are we going to proceed? Well, first I'd like to talk a little bit about how we define the edge of the field. These edges will take some different forms, and I'm going to focus on agronomic strategies. Agronomic strategies, but to improve environmental nitrogen and phosphorus outcomes. Frankly, if we do a really good job in the field, we can minimize the number of these edge of field investments we have to make. We can minimize the amount of land area a producer might have to remove from production for things other than, let's say, erosion control. So part of the purpose here is, in a partnership with the producer and a partnership with the other folks that a producer is working with, have an overall productive outcome that keeps Louisiana shrimp fishermen in business. Remember, there is absolutely nothing in the United States Constitution that says a Kentucky corn grower can put a Louisiana shrimp fisherman out of business. And because it's not there, that means the rest of it ends up in the courts. Our job is to put lawyers out of business. Let's keep it out of court. Let's do a good job professionally. Therefore, I argue that if you work to improve nutrient use efficiency in the field environment, you will also have greater water environmental quality, and you will have created a win-win. This is an edge of the field. It's the bottom of the root zone, the tiling depth, because the water reaches that level and then comes out, usually in the form of a surface ditch. Sometimes in some soil environments, you get quite a bit of leaching, though, so it can actually leach further down into aquifers. There's another edge of the field. That's the top of the crop canopy. And when the crop's not there, it's the soil surface. So when you have an environmental impact and the crop is present, you have quite a bit of buffering between that edge of field and the soil surface. But when the crop is gone, when you have no cover crop there, when all you have is residues, or maybe you've done fall tillage and you don't even have those, you've reduced that buffer zone and now you have a lower edge of field. So my argument is the good infield management will lessen the edge of field loss. I'm going to focus on infield management. All right, how many people have heard of the 4 R's by now? On the adult side, you've probably heard it to death. Okay? I understand that. Part of the reason you're going to keep hearing about it is, number one, we need to train the next generation to understand where we're at right now. We expect them to do better. By the way, my generation's been kicking the can down the road to you guys for a long time, and we're going to keep right on kicking. On the other hand, that equals employment, so look at it on the plus side. Okay? But all of these do contribute to improved nitrogen and phosphorus use efficiency and therefore improved water quality. In general, the closer your nutrient application matches the nutrient need of the crop you're growing, while minimizing losses, the greater will be the nutrient use efficiency. The greater the efficiency, the lower the rate of needed fertilizer. The greater the efficiency, the lower or the magnitude of the leakiness of the system for either nitrogen or phosphorus. So let's talk about rate. This is a big challenge in the industry. When crop prices are low and headed lower, fertilizer prices are low and headed lower, and margins on fertilizer and crops are low and headed lower, what you have right now is the biggest game of chicken in row crop ag in the United States. A lot of my producers that are my clients are not booking. They're waiting. They see their cash grain prices going down. They figure fertilizer prices are going to slide. And last week, according to DTN, they did slide some more. So a lot of these guys are playing chicken with their local retailer on booking fall or spring fertilizer. But the rate comes from having an understanding of a good soil fertility testing program, which is based largely in field research. Now, soil testing is not without its problems. Generally, despite the evidence to the contrary, we would like producers to test more of their acres more intensively, more often. We would like them to assess nitrogen a little deeper than what a lot of them are willing to do. And we would prefer they be concerned about phosphorus towards the surface, where runoff water can carry soluble and particulate P. But in general, one of the biggest single issues in rate is the recommendation philosophy behind that rate recommendation. But in any case, we need to build more confidence in soil testing so we get more acres done more often. There's a number of different interpretive approaches. You can get the same exact set of soil test results, and you can get 3 or 4 different, and I mean very different, recommendations. Generally speaking, they fall in these broad categories, these first 3. Build up and maintenance, which I call kind of fertilizing the soil, building it up to a level, and then maintaining that level moving forward. There's another group of adherents to what's called the sufficient level of available nutrients concept, which basically fertilizes the crop. Yes, you use the soil test as a guideline, but you're fertilizing, amortizing the value of the fertilizer for the current crop you grow. And then there's another group, the nutrient balance group, which started out trying to just ratio certain basic cations, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and they ended up using nutrient balance as a general concept throughout their recommendations. And then there's a few others that are somewhat mixed in, like insurance fertility, yield goals, and the like. These words get interchanged at times. Here's an example of a soil test reporting form where they have these results up here, 199 solvent pounds per acre, pounds of P, 344 pounds of K, 197 pounds of magnesium. Soil pH is already 7. They use yield goal here. That's why it's listed here as 200 bushel corn. 250 pounds of N, 60 pounds of P2O5, 80 pounds of K2O, and these are called maintenance recommendations. What are we maintaining here? The lab itself identifies 199 pounds of P as high. If 199 pounds of P is high, which means you have zero probability of an economic response to phosphorus. What are you doing by recommending 60 pounds of P2O5? You have no idea whether that's going to be taken off. And at 199 pounds, you can go 5 years at 200 bushels, and you won't lower that soil test to a level where you get a response. And we have data to back that up. And most universities do. But only a few of us get paid to talk about it. So, now this lab does report these base saturations, but this is not the basis of their potassium magnesium recommendations. For example, mags here are a little low, so they would have normally recommended some mag if they were basic cation saturation ratio or nutrient balance. Also, this nitrogen recommendation, this actually is from the state of Kentucky, is about 1.25 pounds of N per bushel. I'll show you data later that says that's way above where you ought to be. This is one from our lab. We are a sufficient level of available nutrient laboratory. P at 103 is already very high, and because of that, by the way, the crop here is soybean. No P2O5. The difference in a sufficiency lab outcome is when it reaches high, it's a 0. That's the real difference. With labs that do maintenance, maintenance means there's always a P and a K recommendation, period, because you're going to maintain it no matter how high that salt test is.
Getting back to the soil testing, where you're testing, and I'm not saying you're right or wrong on maintenance versus that, but if you're not getting a lot of samples, that data is good to give us a reference point, but it doesn't tell us what everything is.
It tells you, assuming you have a representative soil sample, it tells you what is in that area that that sample is supposed to represent. Now, if it represents 10 acres, it's 10 acres. If it's a grid acre, a 2.5 acre grid, it's a 2.5 acre grid. But the flaws in soil sampling are not a justification for unnecessary fertilizer sales. The flaws in soil sampling are dealt with by doing a better job of soil sampling more often. So you can see here, we've got, because it's soybeans, of course, you know, soybeans after soybeans, I might add, for seed production. No nitrogen is recommended, and the potash was a little bit low, so they did recommend some K2O. This is an example I give my students in my class. This is from a lab that does believe in the nutrient balance approach. These are a little hard to read. These are pounds per acre, so they didn't recommend any calcium because they found it was adequate to be slightly positive. Magnesium was a little bit negative for what they wanted. Potassium was a little bit negative for what they wanted, so they decided to make it up with sulfomag. By far the most expensive source of potassium on the planet. So, they also have an unnecessary boron and an unnecessary zinc application because they wanted to balance out against what they saw as a high iron, high manganese, and a relatively high copper level. So this is where nutrient balance gets you into trouble. By the way, does anyone here believe the plants are not selective absorbers of what they recover from the root zone environment?
They're not.
You believe they're not. You believe they just passively take in whatever is presented to them by the soil solution. Absolutely untrue. They would have died a million years ago and we wouldn't be here. Plants selectively absorb and selectively fight against certain things they can't fight very well, herbicide being one of those. Okay? But when it comes to basic cations and things like that, plants have been selective absorbers. That's what they have evolved to do. Now, you put them in a terrible situation where it's really salty out there, and you'll kill them with osmolarity. But with these guys, this recommendation here, unnecessary sulfur, the nitrogen might have been okay. I had an ENR value of 70. So, the sufficiency level which most of the public labs use, state labs and university labs, not all, but most, no fertilizer is recommended at high to very high soil test level. They generally need to have correlation and calibration information before they make recommendations. And they definitely work to adjust suboptimal nutrient levels for a given crop. The strength is they're based in the law of diminishing returns. Fertilizer, yield responses to fertilizer don't just go straight up. They go up and they level off. Okay? Now when corn is $6, you can go a little further out here. But when corn is $3, you better be going the other way. Because that's what the economic part of the law of diminishing returns means. So economics can be applied on a yearly basis. If you're soil testing and putting on fertilizer regularly, you can adjust your fertilizer nutrient management scheme with sufficiency level approach on a year-to-year economic basis. So we use this response data that a lot of the states have. Illinois, Kentucky continue to collect it. Iowa does too. We're trying to find factors that allow us to group the response. In Illinois, they use the maximum return to nitrogen protocol, which is a mathematical algorithm that takes yearly economics into account. And they've divided the state roughly into thirds. Northern, Central, and Southern Illinois have different MRTN models for the data that University of Illinois has. In Kentucky, we group it differently. We group by drainage, tillage, and previous crop. So they use these MRTN rates. Now, I hear this all the time. I give a lot of talks to growers. Well, my yields have been going up, and how come the university recommendations haven't changed in years? All the universities now care about is water quality. They don't care about my profit. That's actually pretty bloody bogus. Here's some data that was collected in the literature. And we're looking at the economically optimal rate of nitrogen and redivided it by the bushel yields they got. And it's pretty clear that in these days yields were lower. Not that the nitrogen rates were higher, yields were lower, so the nitrogen requirement to meet the optimum yield was about 1 pound of nitrogen per bushel. But by the time we were in 2000, we were down to 0.75. So when you got a lab that's recommending 1.25 pounds of N per bushel yield goal, when the reality is 0.75, that's half a pound of N. 50 pounds of N for every 100 bushel. That's a lot of extra nitrogen that the crop doesn't need, doesn't always utilize. It uses some of it. Corn with high protein. Anybody here in the feed industry? Anybody ever saw corn sold on the basis of protein content? Occasionally, but not yellow corn, not feed grade. What does that mean? That means that you put more nitrogen in the corn grain than what you really need to make yield. You've given the chicken guy a right to buy less soybean meal, but you haven't got anything more in your pocket for doing it. This isn't hard-bred winter wheat country. Hard-bred winter wheat is sold on a protein basis, but it's to make a minimum level of protein. If you go below it, you get docked. You get above a certain amount, you get premiums. Here's some data where we took just Kentucky data. Some of it's earlier, some of it was as late as 03. And our average pretty well fits the literature, 0.74. There is another tool that some soil testing labs will provide you. They'll provide you an estimated nitrogen release. It's based on the amount from the organic matter. Here's an example, 5% nitrogen in some region of Illinois where they assumed 3% organic matter with about 3,000 pounds of nitrogen per that. Okay, that's how we get that amount of nitrogen. Mineralization rate is going to depend on characteristics of climate. They estimate about 90 pounds per acre will be made available. We get a little more, and we're warmer in Kentucky, so we get a little bit more per percent. You go to northern Illinois, Minnesota, they're going to get a little less per percent, but we get a little more. So this is a tool for understanding how much nitrogen the soil might deliver on average. You have a cold year, Not as good. If you have a warm year, a little more. And this is the basis for programs like Adapt-N, which comes out of Cornell, like Encirca, which comes from Pioneer DuPont, and like field scripts, the nitrogen subroutines in those, which comes out of Monsanto. Maybe Monsanto Bayer or Bayer Monsanto soon. A colleague of mine, Dr. Lloyd Murdoch, published in an extension handout the consequences of bad recommendations. And these are mostly bad rates. This axis here is percent of sufficiency, because we looked at, or he looked at, I only helped him with this on a couple sites, he looked at corn, wheat, and soybeans. You couldn't express the yields all in one axis, so it's just percent of whatever you got. So if the UK lab, that's us right here, if we recommended 100 pounds of fertilizer, these other labs started at 185 and went up to 239. Now there it's a pound for a pound for a pound. Over here is what the fertilizer cost was in dollars per acre per year. So for every $100, 156, 187, 193, 230. Up here you have what they had. We had one lab that was a sufficiency lab, but it also made maintenance recommendations. This one made micronutrients. This was a nutrient balance outfit plus maintenance. This was a nutrient balance outfit plus maintenance plus micros. Over here is the relative yield they got. So for every 100 units of yield, this lab got 104, 197, 95. My question, and I always take the worst case scenario to make this point, how'd you like to spend $130 more and end up with 5% less yield? You wouldn't. You wouldn't want that for your client going forward either, I argue. Not if you want to live long and prosper in this business. Yield goals were once very much favored in the Corn Belt, but they've already passed out of fashion. Iowa's gotten rid of them. Illinois has gotten rid of them. And Indiana was the last state of the Big I states to go. Any question on rates before I move to some of these other issues? Sir?
I got a question on, you were talking about the high, very high levels on the soil test. How and where do you come up with the number that's high?
We have response information that tells us where we're at. Yield of corn, yield of soybean, yield of wheat, yield of tobacco in our case as well. So our very high cutoff is different. Sorry? Productivity. And we have a range of production environments. We have some irrigation. So we have done trials, and we're doing more trials actually of irrigation as it expands. Yeah. Illinois has a lot of data that supports their P&K high, very high cutoffs too. So my argument is there's absolutely no reason other than putting fertilizer out there to do it. There's no reason to be putting on fertilizer when soil tests for that nutrient are already high to very high.
I understand that. However, there's some soil that will respond to different levels than other soil.
There are. And one of the things that we have in Kentucky, one of the biggest single factors in P&K is texture. So that's why the tri-state fertilizer recommendations, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, those recommendations take that into account. They have different critical levels based on texture for that very reason, and it really determines what level is the effective level. You need a higher level with clay soils, let's say for beef, things like that. So that's reflected in those recommendations. Sir?
Would you say that we're getting a different weather pattern, that we're getting longer, drier periods, longer wetter periods, and that puts us at risk? And how much do you put on as farmers to make it more risky on what we get for a yield?
Let's separate this out. Do we have a risk of less uniformity in moisture? It appears from the literature I've read, I'm not a meteorologist, but it appears from the literature that I read that you are absolutely correct. So the question is, if the crop is faced with periods of wetness, which equals low oxygen, periods of dryness, which equals low water, how do you buffer against that? Does any anybody really think that above basic maintenance that fertilizer is a good buffer for water stress? Didn't think so. Water stress, whether it's too much water, which is actually low oxygen. Oxygen is the least appreciated nutrient for a plant. Whether it's low oxygen or low water, fertilizer, the only way fertilizer helps is if it helps you grow a better root system so you have some buffer against drought. But once you get on basic maintenance rated fertilizer, you already got that covered. So it's not a good story. Now, that's not the only answer though. There are some strategies where if you've applied your nutrition here and it starts getting wet and you can't get back in to apply, let's say, a second dose of nitrogen, what could you have done here that might have extended the value, particularly of nitrogen? P and K, this is pretty much irrelevant for. Yes, there are some things you could have done. And I'll get into some of that on sources. But you could have added a nitrification inhibitor. That would have at least shoved it further along into a potential period of wetness before you started to lose some to denitrification or leaching. That's just one example.
But I think, that's kind of where a lot of people know they need to get access to the field, and where drainage is really that key to getting the crops in, to getting them protected, and to get the crops out. So that's really, I'd say, the nice intersection of those demands that farmers face.
If you can manage drainage the way I do it in Michigan, I have 4 farms in Michigan. The way I do it in Michigan, it's still an unmanaged system. I put the tiles in, flip the switch when I pull the stoppers out, and that's it. It's going to drain all the time. Now, controlled drainage for my farms was not an option. Way too much slope. I had a gauging structure every 5 feet going up the bloody field. But you see where I'm going here, okay? But I agree with you. If you can help control that water, yes, then you can help manage it. It gives you a window of access during a wet period. And if you can control it, it gives you a window of wetter soil during a dry period. But again, it's not a substitute for fertilizer. In matter of fact, if you mismanage nitrogen in a now drained soil environment, you've set yourself up for some additional issues with nitrate coming out the end of those tile.
Which also bumps your upside with reduction by
True.
20%. So a lot of our northwestern part of the state of Minnesota, we're really seeing nice yields with tile.
You are. And we see nice yields too. In my farms in Michigan, I moved back planting days by an average of 2.5 weeks. 2.5 weeks by putting tile in. That alone yields 30 bushel an acre on corn. But you know what? I'm not putting on, well, me and my partner, we're not putting on a pound more nitrogen. But we're getting a lot better nitrogen usage. Because what was happening when we planted 2.5 weeks later, put nitrogen on, a lot of it just got denitrified because the soil is still wet. Now I'm planting earlier, the soil is drier, the nitrogen stays in place, the crop recovers it, plus I'm now split applying nitrogen instead of crowding it all into one, which I was doing before. Okay? By the way, when you have an agronomist like me actually practicing on the farm, it's kind of like a mechanic's car at times. Remember that?
That's fun.
Well, I get to practice what I preach, or in some cases not practice what I preach. But I've been on both sides. The only side I've never been, I've never tried to sell fertilizer. I did that. Yeah, and I had to pay tuition for my son's engineering degree at Purdue. All right. Now, nutrient management more and more has environmental consequences. And I argue that doesn't have to be. I argue we can do better. I'm not going to argue it's not going to cost. That's stupid. But I argue that maybe some lower level investments on the upfront side will minimize some of these edge of field solutions. So we need to be more timely, again, fighting this weirdness in the weather. We need to be more precise. I argue that in the future, single large doses are going to be less likely for any manure source, but particularly for manure and biosolids, or phosphorus because of these externalities. We all know that small plants have a difficult time utilizing all that pre-plant or at-plant nutrients we put on. This is some work Dave Mengel did back in the mid-90s, or at least he reported it then. And, you know, your B3 corn plant doesn't have a lot of capacity to take up nitrogen. B12, things are looking considerably better. On the other hand, there is some physiology data that shows that if you don't have adequate nitrogen at B5, you will not have ear length, you will not have row number. And remember, in corn, when you lose a row, you don't lose one row, you lose two. Okay? It goes 2 rows at a time. A corn ear with an uneven number, an odd number of rows is like a 4-leaf clover. Real rare. So, and by R2, we're already on the downhill side here in terms of nitrogen uptake. So you've got to get it done. Another thing, some farmers say, well, I'd like to put fertilizer on because the fertilizer costs less, and I want to have it on because I could buy it cheaper. Well, guess what? Soil doesn't pay any interest. It's not a bank account. I know bank accounts don't pay much interest now either. But because of losses, fixation, erosion being 2, you actually get negative interest. Well, most bank accounts haven't gone that bad, unless you had Wells Fargo signing up your accounts here recently. But this biological chemical uncertainty makes the soil fertilizer bank a lot less valuable than the dollars in the bank. So smaller, more annual doses of fertilizer are more efficient than larger maintenance applications that are applied less often. And also inflation, when it rears its head, which it invariably will cause the present value of residual soil fertility to be even lower because it's discounted going forward in the future. Everybody's interested. This is a really ugly shot I got from John Sawyer at Iowa State. We're really interested in not having this in a cornfield, or a wheat field for that matter. We do care about volatilization of ammonia in some situations. We care about leaching of nitrate in some, particularly sandy soil situations. And we really care about this one. This one here is entirely due to denitrification, just ponding of water and loss of nitrogen. And we also, in Kentucky, where we use a lot of no-till, we care about immobilization. So if you supply urea, even with a urease inhibitor, that residue is breaking down. Those microbes are the first hog at the trough. They're going to grab that nitrogen as they're breaking down that residue. And that's not a bad thing. It conserves it going forward, but it's bad for you in terms of your immediate crop. Okay? Unless you change to a cover crop that's got a low C to N ratio, like hairy veg. We can get past the immobilization and the volatilization by placing nitrogen below the surface. That has proven to be very successful. It works very well, but you got to have the steel and the time to do it. Sometimes, as this gentleman pointed out, you don't have the time you want. You got a lot of acres to get over. And maybe your dealer doesn't have a lot of steel for you to use either. Another thing we can do is delay or split the nitrogen. In general, 2016 in Kentucky not being a good example, in general, once we get out of April into May into June, we have a lower likelihood of rainfall so that we can get nitrogen on while corn is still small enough to get over it, and we can reduce the likelihood that cornfield is going to have wetness in it that's going to drive leaching or denitrification. So the benefit of a split is primarily that. Now you do see a technology here. Sorry. These are green seeker units on this toolbar. How many people here have had real field experience with green seekers or canopy reflective sensors? One over here, another one here. Okay. These are about, because they're early generation, they represent good science, but it's limited. They're about the dumbest darn sensors you can imagine. They don't just sense greenness. They sense how much greenness, which means they're really sensitive to biomass. So for example, this corn yield here data, this is from one of my studies at Princeton, Kentucky. Here is corn grain yield at the end of the season as a function of the NDVI value when the NDVI values are taken at either V6 or V8. Anybody think these look pretty good? Anybody think they don't look pretty good? They look really good. I loved it, except that it was from a phosphorus study. Phosphorus stunts plants. Okay? Stunting means low biomass. So what the sensor was sensing was not nitrogen, but phosphorus. Now, how many have ever seen one of these hooked up to a phosphorus applicator? Didn't think so. Now, I don't think we can go forward and say increasing the nitrogen rate to get around these nitrogen losses is going to be very effective going forward. Insurance end is something that's going to go away. So my question to producers, dealers, consultants is, have you looked at alternatives? You don't always have to use steel and time. You can modify your nitrogen sources with some proven chemistry. One is you can reduce the likelihood of denitrification by using a nitrification inhibitor. Products on the market include nitropyrin, which is marketed as N-Serve or Instinct, depending on what you're putting it in, and diamide, which is a component of SuperU, or urea-based materials. And Agrotene International has combined DCD with NBPT and another formulation for liquid, UAN. I think it's called Agrotene Plus, but don't quote me. If you just need a volatilization inhibitor, you can use this one, and there are now a lot of other NBPT formulations on the market because the molecule is off patent. Just remember to look on the jug, because the dealer has to formulate to give about 1.2 pounds AI of NBPT per ton urea. And if the jug, and a number of them are like this, says, well, all these ingredients equal 100%, he'll be clueless as to how much NBPT to put on. You won't know. And don't follow the recommendation given by the chap who's trying to sell these products. Get the actual NBPT analysis. I've been asked this question a lot about new inhibitors. Honestly, there are some out there. I evaluated one this year. It looks pretty good. It's new chemistry. It's new chemistry. That would be great. I can't talk about it other than say it. It'd be great to have new chemistry. Just some data. This is somewhere we had UAN plus Instinct, and we got a pretty good response at 80 pounds of N, and another pretty good response at 120 pounds of N on a poorly, somewhat poorly drained soil in this case. We looked at a number of these. Actually, Schwab and Ordog did most of this work. Looked at a number of these urease inhibitors. Ammonium nitrate is our gold standard in this particular case. Here's our check, yielded about 105 in yield, and this is all at 75 pounds of N per acre, so these are all in the responsive region. 170 with ammonium nitrate, urea alone about 155. Agrotene brings it up close. SuperU brings it up close. ESN applied correctly. That's the one that's got the polymer coating on it. Also brought it up pretty good. Nutrisphere was a failure. Phosphorus use efficiency. Our biggest problem, sorry.
Back up on that one again. These are all at 75.
Yep, so they're all in that very responsive region. Yep. Water quality and phosphorus use efficiency. Some people argue you can put phosphorus on when the crop needs it, but you can't wait till you have a deficiency symptom where phosphorus is concerned. That's a little bit late. You got to get it on in time. Some people are broadcasting phosphorus prior to seeding, but the problem is seeding times for spring sown crops is wet time. You're going to get some potential water movement. Now, I don't mind broadcasting, but I'm arguing in no-till environments, we're probably going to have to go with incorporation. I think it's just going to be part of life going forward. Particularly in those sensitive areas, my part of Michigan is just above the part that's contributing to the west end of Lake Erie. I'm not in the St. Joe watershed, thank God. But I'm literally 1 mile from the dam. I'm lucky I'm on the other dividing line of the next watershed over. Those guys are getting hit pretty hard. The only thing distracting them in Michigan is lead in Flint water supply. They've got another environmental problem in Michigan. Again, what are we doing here in terms of where do we put this on? Well, the more your soil can fix phosphorus, the more likely you are to move your timing closer to seeding anyway. People who put phosphorus on in the fall were in soils that didn't fix phosphorus very well. A lot of Illinois, a lot of Argentina is the same way. But you move right across the border into Brazil and it's ugly. They banned applying at seeding and they can't even find it 6 months later on those soils in Mato Grosso and Mato Grosso do Sul. They fix phosphorus hard. Now, every state, I reviewed Illinois' phosphorus index. Every state has a phosphorus index where you can assess what your runoff potential is for fields or parts of fields. And you definitely want to get closer to seeding, and you definitely want to think about putting it below the surface in environments like this. Because phosphorus does exhibit low within soil mobility, banding is definitely an option to improve phosphorus availability. This is the way it was done. And I say was. I think this is going to go away. I really do. It's really problematic in a lot of watersheds. And I think we need to be ahead of the game for our clients, helping them understand. We've got a faculty member who's working literally on a poultry litter injector. Now, with my dad, I raised hogs for the first 20 years of my life. We never had liquid swine manure. We always had the other kind, okay? Which means there was no way we were injecting that stuff. And I didn't think you could inject poultry litter either, but that technology's coming along. Again, getting it below that surface. So this placement is being driven by environmental considerations, getting it below the surface, keeping it away from the moving runoff water. And I like cover crops to help with this, but they're not the entire solution. Because remember, when a cover crop dies, you've brought phosphorus and nitrogen, for that matter, right up to the surface, just like your residues have. Okay? It's cycling up. So you've got to keep utilizing that and keep making sure you understand that when you put on the next dose of fertilizer. If we look at strategies that involve no fall or surface application, we can still do placement or banding below the surface, but that takes skill and slows down planting. In Kentucky, and I think it's probably worth more in Illinois, but in Kentucky it's been calculated, planting time is worth $1,000 an hour. Okay? And that was figured with 24-row equipment and fairly large farms. All right? So you have to slow down to refill that phosphorus unit during planting time. So maybe it'd be better to think about some split injection stuff where you put your phosphorus down, say with your anhydrous, if you're putting it down, say a week or two before planting, if you have the window. Additives. I've looked at 15 of these so far. I haven't found a single one that was worth a tinker's do.day. I think the ones that work already got bought. Monsanto has bioag now. Pioneer hasn't sold a corn seed in the last several years that didn't have coated between coatings a biological. I trust they bought that and put it in there because it costs them to put it on that seed because it works. The big companies are actively looking for those things that work, and I doubt we're going to see them as independent products. That's just John Crow's crystal ball. Another possibility for affected or afflicted watersheds with phosphorus is, can we tie up, temporarily fix available fertilizer, manure, phosphorus? There's been some work already done with gypsum, and there's been some work done with iron waste materials coming out of slags and stuff. They work. The thing I don't like about the iron one, typically phosphorus fixed to iron is no longer likely to ever be bioavailable in your lifetime. Now, why would you go and spend all that good money for feed fertilizer, get your soil test built to the level where you end up having to try to fix part of it? No. Not efficient. Phosphorus rock resources in the world are finite, although we don't know what that number is. We know they're finite. So let's not do this. one is an active research interest. Everybody loves better living through chemistry. What if I could spray something on the surface of a field, and all I got to do is solubilize and move that phosphorus a quarter inch or maybe a little bit more below that surface where that runoff water goes. Get it out of that zone. Believe me, there's a number of labs looking at that who would love to patent it. It ain't happened yet, but they're looking. Last thing I want to talk about is another way to putting phosphorus where you want it and avoiding where you don't. You can do it field by field, although generally, in deference to the comment made earlier about representative nature of soil testing, you don't want more than 10 acres. Some people were using a grid sampling approach, but at least in the regions I've worked in, grid sampling has fallen by the wayside in favor of zone sampling based on either yield management or yield zones or soil map unit zones. This is an example from a client where they have this phosphorus map here. This is for AP1 Salt SP. They have values ranging from some pretty low, ugly ones down below 30, all the way up to some areas that tested well above 100. Phosphorus application rate recommendation, of course, those got zeros, so that these, and these ones in blue, they got a pretty good dose of P2O5. So this is a way of putting phosphorus where it's needed, where it's more likely to be held by the soil because the salt test P is already low, and it's not going to contribute as much to water quality issues. We did a study where we looked at the value of redistributed lime P2O5 and K2O per acre relative to the value of the field average recommendation, which you would have got if you just took each field and took a single sample. And I'm going to talk about the potash one because in Kentucky right now we have a statewide problem with declining soil test K levels, and it's getting serious. We got to. I know potassium's $450 a ton, and it was never that before, but guys are going to have to get over it. We did a survey of soybean fields, and the single biggest factor limiting soybean yield wasn't soybean cyst nematode. It was soil test K. So we've got grids where potassium was not applied because they were higher than average. We've got grids where extra K2O needed to be applied because they were lower than the average. And we averaged that across the whole field area, because that's how growers tend to look at it. And I decided, well, what was it worth when it was cheap? $150 a ton. Here's the value of the redistributed K in dollars per acre for just the K2O. With $150 a ton K, and this is the field average soil test K, in this region right in here, which is close to our critical level, we were easily getting around, let's say around 5, say 4 to 7 bucks. Multiply that by 3, and it's just K2O. You're now at 12 to 21 bucks an acre, and that's just the value of the redistributed potash. Doesn't include the redistributed lime or the redistributed phosphate. Notice when you get fields where average soil test is high, you don't get any value from grid sampling because all the grids are high. And when you have all the grids being low, you don't get any value from redistributing because they're all low. But the economics of precision ag, at least soil sampling, has changed. Again, 3 times the fertilizer on K. And what dealers are telling me is that precision ag has gone up some, but not up like it's gone up for the fertilizer. Although fertilizer prices are coming down. So that concludes my presentation, and I'll take questions. Or you can, if you think of one later, that's my email address. Sir?
I got a question on applying P. We've tried moving it from fall till spring. This spring, we can't do it when it's frozen or soon. When the ground is, in our area, when the ground is ready to drive on, we plant corn. So we were trying to apply phosphorus at corn planting, and it didn't get done. So can we go into V3, 4, 5 and apply phosphorus? Do you have any value to that ground?
The literature suggests it would be of some value as long as you keep it before V5. And you would be wise to band it or dribble it if you're forced to surface dribble as a liquid like 1034O close to the stalk, because it's not like UAN where you can, I don't care what Y drop says, tell with them guys. It's not like UAN. UAN, you could put it down the center of 30-inch rows and the roots will get it fine. Phosphate doesn't move like that, so it's better off. If you're going to be applying it, try to get it close to the, dribble it low and close to the row. Otherwise, just band it about 6 inches away so you don't prune the roots.
If we're wanting to do thousands of acres, and
Understood?
I mean, spreading it with a spreader DAP, you'd say would be
In this, I'm going to resist. I mean, I understand what you're saying. You could do it, but I'm going to resist that because again, you're still applying it in the spring. V3 is still potentially a wet period. You could get a heavy rain right after that surface application of that DAP, and you've got some significant risk depending on what level of residue you don't have from your cover crop and previous crop.
But as we move from fall to spring, this is the issues we're going to face.
I agree. And I admit, are you guys in your area pre-planting any anhydrous?
Very little, because when the soil is ready, we plant cover.
Yeah.
Well, whenever that is.
Yeah. And what I see is some producers are getting tools so that what's happening is they've got one group of people out there applying at-plant, pre-plant, at-plant fertilizer, N&P usually, using some of these dual rigs, and then they're going with their corn planters on separate rigs. It's expensive. But if you're in a low-risk phosphorus environment, meaning you haven't got your salt test built into the high range, if you're not in a high phosphorus index environment on the hydrology side, meaning a lot of slope, things like that, then for me, it's still going to be viable for a while. But just remember, now, there are some places where they probably won't even allow this going forward. Maryland, Northwest Ohio. We're going to see some changes that are going to challenge all of us. So I'd rather try to get you on the right track if you can afford it, which with $3 corn, that's going to be hard. But I'd rather at least try to get you on the right track mentally going forward, even if you do end up broadcasting DAP on V3 corn. But I wouldn't recommend waiting until V6. You do not wait for symptom expression. You go by soil test where P is concerned.
But basically, you go when the soil is fed.
Yes. Yeah. And we've had serious compaction issues in Kentucky for the past 2 spring seasons. And this is last fall was wet too, so this is the first fall where we've been dry enough to do a little ripping that would be effective. You got to have dry soil to really get a good shatter off shanks. Sir.
How fast does DAP melt down or break down and it's plant available? There's 2 questions I'm asking. One is if you're surface applying and you're stuck doing that, how fast does it bind to the soil? I'm not saying that the soil's not going to take it, but let's say it's binding the soil. How fast does that typically happen with, say, a DAP product?
DAP is a soluble salt. It's not as soluble as potassium chloride, but it's certainly a soluble salt. So a 1/4-inch rain will melt it down pretty good, unless they've used a co-granulated product with it that somehow affects how the granules slump. And then the minute it starts to react, it'll start reacting with the soil. Now, granules react a little differently than liquids, which tend to have a bigger splash effect and get spread out, surface area-wise. Granule dissolution chemistry affects the nearby soil. And DAP, when it dissolves, raises soil pH to about 8. Okay? MAP lowers soil pH to about 5. It's just how they dissolve and what they do. Okay? So you just got to be aware that there's little differences in chemistry here. So both of them are soluble. They will break down, again, unless there's something co-granulated with them that somehow affects that.
Then the next question would be how fast does it mineralize so it's plant available?
When it dissolves, it's plant available.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, then the question is, what's your surface rooting environment like? Guys who plant corn too deep, their roots aren't as close to the surface. Let's be blunt. Okay. On the other hand, you can't be too shallow for other reasons, but Remember, that phosphate is right there on the surface, and it's not going to move real quickly. So you've got to have some part of the root system. Now, it's the nice thing about plants. Plants have a gene built into them to sense high localized level of phosphorus. They do what's called root hair proliferation. When they sense a granule of P, they will literally proliferate root hairs to grab it. So it's a whole lot better to have it on the surface than to have it with strip tillage 6 inches down and you got nothing. I hate strip tillage. I like strip tillage for strip tillage, but I hate strip tillage for nutrient placement. Sir?
Talking about the DAP, have you seen any differences with applications and the availability of, so like 2 years ago we were looking at fall applied DAP versus spring applied DAP. And then we were doing soil tests looking for water soluble P in the profile.
I have not looked at water soluble P in the profile, but I would not expect either one of those to have unless you had like wormholes or something in there, like what his name Stehauer had over in Ohio, and he found he could actually get phosphate moving through the wormholes straight to tile lines. Without that, I would say water soluble P should be different between spring and fall applied. Now, bioavailable P, we have some soils in Kentucky that fix phosphorus really, not as strong as Brazil, but strong. So what we have discovered is if you apply phosphorus in the fall, say right now, and then you have the same dose, same amount of P2O5 applied at planting in the spring, we will have less bioavailable P for that corn crop from the fall application because our soils have that ability. Not all, but some have an ability to really fix phosphorus.
We ended up seeing 30 to 40% more water cycle P from our fall application than our spring application.
I have no idea why that would occur. That's what keeps me employed. Lots of opportunities to study new things. Sir?
Is there any difference between availability of phosphorus to the plant on spring applied P between DAP or MAP?
No. At least nothing in the literature, and I have limited data on wheat, which is really, wheat for us is our most sensitive phosphorus crop. Burley tobacco is too. I don't do burley work. And we've applied phosphorus, several sources, 1034O. As long as we correct for the nitrogen difference, because they're not exactly the same, we don't see a difference in phosphorus recovery by the crop. You will occasionally run into a difference in micronutrients because MAP acidifies the soil, and it might make something like zinc available, whereas DAP makes the soil more alkaline, and it might make the zinc, in a marginal zinc environment, might make it a little less available, for at least for a time. Sure.
What kind of time frame are you talking about with the MAP and adjusting that pH?
Typically, it starts to occur immediately upon granule dissolution, and it's real intense around the granule. So in banded MAP and banded DAP, you have an intense change in pH in that band around those granules that are in the band. The persistence of it depends on how well buffered the soil is. So if you've got a heavier textured soil, it doesn't persist very long because that soil fights back with its own buffering, pH buffering against it. And the sandy soil persists longer. And therefore is everything in between. Well, thank you very much. Really appreciate your time.